November 2018, the eastern desert of Egypt, roughly 300 kilometers south of Cairo. A team from the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology in Cairo and the Department of Archaeology, Classics, and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool is excavating a site called Hatnub, an ancient alabaster quarry that had been worked by Egyptian craftsmen for nearly 5,000 years, left and then largely forgotten by modern archaeology. They are following up on previous survey work that had documented a large number of ancient inscriptions and some interesting anomalies in the quarry's topography. What they find, in a section of the quarry they have been methodically clearing, is a ramp. Specifically, what co-director Yanis Gordon will describe to Life Science as a system composed of a central ramp flanked by 2 staircases with numerous post holes. The ramp runs at a gradient of approximately 20%, steeper than any ramp design previously considered viable for moving heavy stone blocks, far steeper than the gentle slopes of the external ramp theories that Egyptologists have been debating for decades. Beside the ramp, cut into the staircase walls at regular intervals, are the post holes. They were for wooden stakes. The stakes were for ropes from the sledge carrying the stone block attached to the wooden posts, running up the staircase alongside workers who applied tension on each stroke to pull the load upward against that steep gradient using the posts as anchor. Points, the same principle as a block and tackle system, using the posts as the fixed point that lets human muscle overcome the weight and the slope. This system, confirmed to date to the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, confirmed to be used by workers extracting stone during the same period the Great Pyramid was being built, confirmed to be the first direct physical evidence of how ancient Egyptians moved large stone blocks vertically, is also what Yanis Gordon described as never having been discovered anywhere else before. The technique works. The evidence for it is physical, preserved in a quarry that the desert sealed for 4,500 years. And it resolves in a single excavation one of the most persistent objections to the conventional explanation of pyramid construction: the problem of what kind of ramp design could actually move millions of tons of stone upward without requiring more material to build the ramp than to build the pyramid. The discovery at Hatnub is one piece of a picture that has been assembling itself through archaeology, through genetics, through documentary analysis, and most recently through particle physics, into the most complete reconstruction of a single ancient engineering project that the history of science has ever produced. When users asked xAI's Grok to synthesize that complete picture without preset assumptions about what the answer would be, the response was not the simple textbook confirmation that dismisses all questions, nor the sensationalist alternative that requires abandoning everything we know about Bronze Age technology. It was a 3-part answer with different levels of certainty attached to each part, and the level of certainty drops in a specific and interesting way as you move deeper into the structure. The outer layer, who built the pyramids, is the most certain. The evidence is now documentary, physical, forensic, and genetic simultaneously. It converges on the same answer from 4 independent directions. And that answer is ancient Egyptian workers, organized under the authority of Pharaoh Khufu of the 4th dynasty, working across approximately 20 years of continuous construction that began around 2560 BCE. The documentary evidence is the Merer Papyri, discovered in 2013 by French archaeologist Pierre Tallet at a sealed cave at Wadi el-Jarf on the Red Sea coast. Inspector Merer's daily journal, covering several months of operation during the pyramid's final construction phase, records the transportation of white limestone casing blocks from the quarries at Tura, on the eastern bank of the Nile, to the Giza construction site via a canal system that subsequent geological survey has confirmed the existence of. Merer names Pharaoh Khufu. He names administrative officials and locations. He records quantities and dates. He is the closest thing to an eyewitness account of the pyramid's construction that exists, and his account is consistent in every logistical detail with what the physical archaeology has independently established. The physical evidence is Hayt el Ghurab, the workers' settlement southeast of the Giza Plateau, excavated by Mark Lehner's Ancient Egypt Research Associates team beginning in 1988 and continuing for decades. The settlement contains industrial bakeries capable of producing bread at the scale required to feed tens of thousands of rotating workers, breweries, barracks laid out in a grid plan consistent with organized military-style rotation of labor crews, administrative buildings, and a medical facility. The workers buried in the cemetery 500 meters from the settlement show skeletal evidence of systematic medical care, healed, broken. Bones indicating successful resetting, bone regrowth around surgical intervention sites, indicating patients survived procedures that, in the ancient world, were technically difficult. The workforce was not expendable. It was managed and maintained. The forensic evidence is the skeletal pathology itself. The bones in the workers' cemetery show systematic stress patterns consistent with heavy repetitive labor. compressed vertebrae, worn joints, the specific bone deformations associated with sustained heavy lifting across years of work. They also show something more specific. The American anthropologist who analyzed the remains found that the skeletal stress patterns were comparable to those seen in professional athletes and heavy construction workers, not in the random, unmanaged stress distribution of people worked arbitrarily without consideration for their continued usefulness. The workers were pushed hard. They were also kept functional. The documentary and physical picture is confirmed by epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions. In the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber, discovered by Colonel Howard Weiss in 1837 and still accessible today, the surfaces bear graffiti from the work gangs that placed those granite beams. The graffiti includes team names, Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Minkar. These are not anonymous marks of enslaved labor. They are competitive team identities, consistent with a labor organization that divided workers into named gangs, tracked productivity, and created institutional pride in the specific construction assignment. The epigraphy confirms not just the Egyptian identity of the builders, but the organizational culture of the enterprise. The second layer of the answer, how the pyramid was built, is substantially understood and substantially but not completely documented. The how is not one technique. It is a system of techniques, each solving a specific engineering challenge, each now partially evidenced by direct physical discovery. The primary construction material for the pyramid's core is Tura limestone, quarried from the Mokattam Formation approximately 15 kilometers south of Giza. The limestone quarries show the characteristic signatures of ancient Egyptian quarrying: V-shaped cuts from copper chisels, pounding marks from dolerite balls, the grooves from wooden wedges soaked with water to split the stone along natural fracture lines. None of the limestone quarrying technology is mysterious. It is documented in the quarry marks themselves and in depictions in ancient Egyptian tomb art. Copper and dolerite and water expansion do the work. Human teams do the labor. The pace is slow by modern standards and fast by the standards of what manual human effort can sustain over a 20-year period. The transport from quarry to site involved two distinct engineering challenges. Horizontal transport across desert or riverine terrain used wet sand lubrication. Water poured onto sand in front of a loaded sledge reduces the friction coefficient of the contact surface by approximately 50%, making it possible for relatively small teams to move blocks weighing several tons across flat terrain. This mechanism is not theoretical. It is depicted in an ancient Egyptian tomb painting that shows precisely this technique in action, and it has been demonstrated in modern experimental archaeology to work exactly as depicted. The wet sand and sledge system is confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence. The Hatnub ramp system addresses vertical transport, the problem of lifting blocks to successively higher levels as the pyramid grows. The specific design, with its steep gradient, flanking staircases, and post holes for rope leverage, allows blocks to be pulled up steeper slopes than the friction-limited angle possible on a simple inclined plane. The post holes serve as the fixed mechanical advantage point. Workers on the staircase grip the rope that runs from the sled around the post and apply force in a more advantageous direction, effectively multiplying the available pulling force the way. A capstan or pulley system does. The mathematical analysis of this system suggests it would have been capable of handling blocks in the multi-ton range on gradients steep enough to make short interior or exterior ramps practical, rather than requiring the massive material investment of long, shallow external ramps. The granite used in the King's Chamber and the Grand Gallery came from Aswan, 800 kilometers upstream on the Nile. At an average weight between 25 and 80 tons per block for the chamber's ceiling beams, transport was almost certainly primarily riverine, rafted down the Nile during flood season, when the high water level reduced the energy required to move heavily loaded vessels. The harbor canal that Merer's papyri describe would have allowed the granite barges to approach the pyramid site directly, minimizing the overland transport distance for the heaviest elements. Merer specifically does not discuss granite. His team transported limestone, but the canal infrastructure he documents would have served the granite supply chain as well. The finishing work on granite used flint and quartzite abrasives. Flint registers at approximately 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, nearly equivalent to the quartz content of Aswan granite, and surviving tool marks and unfinished granite elements at Giza are consistent with abrasive grinding and polishing rather than cutting. The joints in the King's Chamber's granite-facing stones, where they are accessible for measurement, are tight to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, achievable by progressive abrasion on surfaces that were repeatedly checked against each other until the contact was uniform. The arithmetic of the whole enterprise resolves, in the hands of researchers who have worked through it carefully, to a specific and manageable number. 2.3 million blocks at an average of 2.5 tons each, transported and placed over approximately 20 years of construction at a pace of roughly 300 blocks per day. In effective working hours per day, roughly 10 hours of productive labor, that means a block placed approximately every 2 minutes of work at the quarry, transport, and placement stages combined. The workforce required to sustain this pace, given the transport distances and the documented methods, is consistent with the 10,000 to 20,000 rotating workers documented at Hayt El Ghorab, supplemented by a permanent core of several thousand skilled craftsmen handling the precision work. The numbers are large, they are not impossible. What remains imperfectly understood in the how layer is the specific method by which the pyramid's orientation was established before the first block was placed. The Great Pyramid's 4 sides are aligned to true north, south, east, and west, with a deviation of less than 0.04 of a degree. Less than 3 arc minutes of error across a 230-meter base. The Egyptians had no magnetic compass. Polaris was not the pole star in the 26th century BCE, and the relevant celestial pole position was not occupied by any bright star. The most credible proposal, advanced by archaeoastronomer Kate Spence in a 2000 Nature paper, is that the builders tracked simultaneous transits of 2 stars, Mizar and Kochab, that were positioned above and below the celestial pole at the time of construction, using the vertical line between them as a reference for true north when both stars were simultaneously at the same azimuth. This model is mathematically consistent with the observed alignment error and with the dating of the pyramid's construction. It is not proven by physical discovery, but it is the best evidenced explanation available, and it would have required sustained astronomical observation across a significant period before construction began. The third layer, what remains inside the pyramid, is where the certainty drops most sharply and where the most significant active scientific work is currently focused. The Scan Pyramids Project, an international collaboration using muon radiography to image the pyramid's interior without physical access, announced in 2017 the detection of a large void above the Grand Gallery. The void is approximately 30 meters long and at least 5 meters in height, oriented horizontally and parallel to the Grand Gallery below it. It was detected independently by 3 different muon detector configurations and confirmed by subsequent analysis. Its existence is not disputed. Its purpose is unknown. Muon radiography works by placing particle detectors inside the pyramid's known chambers and measuring the direction and intensity of the muon flux, cosmic ray particles that stream down through the atmosphere and penetrate solid matter at a rate that depends on the density of the material they pass through. Voids allow more muons to pass. By mapping the muon flux from multiple angles, researchers can reconstruct a density map of the pyramid's interior with spatial resolution sufficient to identify previously unknown spaces. The technique is the same in principle as a medical CT scan, using cosmic rays rather than X-rays. The Grand Gallery void was the project's first major finding. In 2023, a second finding was published, a 9-meter corridor immediately. Behind the north face of the pyramid, characterized by muon radiography, ground-penetrating radar, and ultrasonic testing, then visually confirmed by a small endoscopic camera inserted through a narrow opening in the facing stone. The camera showed a vaulted ceiling and bare limestone walls. The corridor's orientation and position suggest it may serve a structural function, redistributing the weight load above the original pyramid entrance, but this interpretation is not confirmed. Its purpose remains formally unknown. These 2 discoveries are not rumors, not interpretations of ambiguous data, not alternative archaeology. They are peer-reviewed findings from instrumented measurement of the pyramid's interior, published in journals, and confirmed by independent international research teams. They describe specific, physically confirmed spaces inside the Great Pyramid of Giza that were not on the architectural plans, that have not been entered in the modern period, and for which no agreed explanation has been established. Grok's synthesis of the complete pyramid evidence record produces the 3-layer answer described here. A fully settled answer to the identity question, a substantially understood but not completely documented answer to the method question, and a precisely specified but unresolved frontier in the internal architecture question. The genuine shock in that synthesis is not any single dramatic revelation, not a lost civilization, not advanced technology, not alien intervention, but the specific and perhaps counterintuitive finding that the structure most studied by modern science since the advent of modern science still contains confirmed physical spaces that nobody has entered, that have no agreed explanation, and that were discovered not by excavation, but by pointing a particle detector at the pyramid and reading what the cosmic rays said about what was on the other side of the stone. That is the honest version of the answer that Grok provides. That is what the evidence shows. And that is why the Great Pyramid of Giza, after 4,000 years of human inquiry and a century of modern scientific instrumentation, remains precisely, specifically, confirmedly more mysterious than it was before we started measuring it carefully. 4,500 years ago, a team of Egyptian workers whose foreman kept a daily journal lowered the last capstone into place. Or perhaps the capstone was never placed. The evidence on that point is uncertain. What is certain is that when they finished, they sealed something inside that structure that we have not opened. Somewhere above the Grand Gallery, 30 meters of undocumented space waits. Somewhere behind the north face, a corridor that a camera has seen but no person has entered lies in limestone silence. What is in those spaces? What did Khufu's architects put there? What did the builders know that they did not write down in Merer's diary or carve into the relieving chambers? That is the frontier. That is the question that remains genuinely, specifically open. And it is a better question, more precisely located, more physically real, more scientifically tractable than any mystery of this pyramid has ever been before. Subscribe. Because the instruments that found those spaces are getting better, and whoever points them at the right wall next could change everything.